Welcome to the Entitled Files, where today we meet Helen Dunham, a helicopter parent who turned her son's middle school education into a military-grade campaign of micromanagement and academic warfare. Her control went unchallenged until she met Ms. Campbell, an 8th-grade English teacher who wasn't about to let one mother rewrite the entire curriculum. From unauthorized private testing teams to Shakespeare rewrites, this educational power struggle is about to show us just how far a helicopter mom can fly. Let's dive in.
Teaching 8th grade English at Riverside Middle School had been my life for the past decade. I'd dealt with every type of student imaginable, from the brilliant daydreamers to the class clowns who thought Shakespeare wrote rap lyrics. I'd navigated helicopter parents, tiger moms, and even what we called ghost parents, the ones who never showed up, not even when their kids set off the fire alarm trying to heat up a burrito in their locker. But nothing in my years of teaching could have prepared me for Hurricane Helen Dunham. The first warning signs appeared during the summer before school started. While most parents were busy buying school supplies or squeezing in last-minute vacations, Mrs. Dunham had already sent 17 emails to the administration about her son Ethan's special educational needs. These weren't your typical concerned parent emails about allergies or learning accommodations. No, these were carefully crafted manifestos, complete with bullet points, citations from obscure educational journals, and, inexplicably, quotes from Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Our principal, Dr. Martinez, a usually unflappable woman who'd once calmly handled a cafeteria food fight involving 300 students and several pounds of mystery meat, forwarded me the emails with a simple note. "Good luck. You'll need it." I should have taken that warning more seriously. The first day of school arrived with its usual chaos. Lost students wandering the halls, locker combinations forgotten within seconds of being received, and the distinct smell of new backpacks mixing with industrial-strength floor cleaner. I stood at my classroom door, greeting my new batch of students with what I hoped was an encouraging smile. Then I saw them coming down the hall. Mrs. Dunham was impossible to miss. She wore a power suit that would have made Hillary Clinton jealous, clutching a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Behind her, looking like he was trying to become invisible, shuffled Ethan, a lanky boy with perpetually untied shoelaces and the resigned expression of someone who had long ago accepted their fate. "Miss Campbell," she announced, extending her hand with the precision of a military commander. "I'm Helen Dunham, Ethan's mother. We need to discuss his educational trajectory." I glanced at my watch. Class wouldn't start for another 10 minutes, but I already had 3 students asking where the bathroom was, and another one crying because her locker wouldn't open. "Perhaps we could schedule a conference during my planning period," I suggested. Mrs. Dunham's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched upward. "This can't wait. Ethan's future is at stake. Did you receive my curriculum enhancement suggestions? I sent them to the board last week. 37 pages, double-spaced with Harvard citations." Behind her, Ethan seemed to shrink another inch. "Mom," he mumbled. "Can I just go to class?" "Not now, sweetie. Mommy's ensuring your academic success." She turned back to me. "Now, about the reading list. I've prepared an alternative selection that better reflects Ethan's advanced cognitive capabilities." I noticed other students starting to gather, watching this exchange with the same fascination usually reserved for watching 2 cars almost collide in the parking lot. "Mrs. Dunham," I said firmly, channeling my best teacher voice, "I'd be happy to discuss this during proper conference hours. Right now, I need to focus on getting all my students settled for their first day." She pressed her lips together, creating a thin line of disapproval. "Very well. But I expect to hear from you today, and I'll need your personal cell phone number. Email is too slow for urgent matters." "The school has my contact information," I replied, already knowing this would become a battle. As she finally released Ethan to slink into the classroom, she leaned in close. "Just so you know," she whispered, "I'm on the board of 3 different educational reform committees, and I have lawyers." Welcome to 8th grade, I thought. Let the games begin. September unfurled like a slow-motion disaster. Mrs. Dunham's opening salvo had just been a warm-up, a gentle preview of the chaos to come. By the end of the first week, she'd created a shared Google Calendar to track Ethan's assignments, which she demanded I update hourly, started a WhatsApp group for parents in my class, that quickly devolved into her personal soapbox, and filed 2 formal complaints about the classroom temperature's potential impact on cognitive function. The first major incident occurred during our initial writing assignment. I'd ask students to compose a personal essay about a meaningful experience in their lives. Simple enough, right? Most kids wrote about winning soccer games, losing pets, or that time they got stuck in an elevator at the mall. Standard 8th grade fare. Ethan turned in a perfectly formatted 5-page essay about the importance of proper vitamin supplementation in adolescent brain development. The writing style suspiciously resembled his mother's emails. During our morning class, I quietly asked Ethan to stay back for a moment. "Did you write this yourself?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He stared at his shoes, which were actually tied for once. "Mom helped." "How much did she help?" "She said my original essay about learning to skateboard wasn't academically ambitious enough." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She made me rewrite it 6 times. Before I could respond, my classroom door burst open. Mrs. Dunham stood there, somehow having materialized like a helicopter parent poltergeist. "I installed a voice-activated monitoring app on Ethan's phone," she announced, striding in. "I heard everything. And I take offense at the implication that I would write my son's essay. I merely provided editorial oversight, structural guidance, and complete content revision." Behind her, our school secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, appeared, looking apologetic. "I'm so sorry," she mouthed. She just ran past the front desk. I took a deep breath, channeling the patience I usually reserved for when students asked if Shakespeare was still alive. "Mrs. Dunham, this assignment was meant to be Ethan's own work. The point was self-expression, not academic perfection." She pulled out her phone, presumably to record our conversation. "Are you suggesting that parental involvement in education is inappropriate? Because I have several peer-reviewed studies about the positive correlation between parent engagement and academic success. There's a difference between engagement and complete takeover," I said, immediately regretting my word choice. "Takeover?" Her voice reaching a pitch that made the classroom hamster hide in its toilet paper roll. "I am supporting my son's academic journey. Did you know that Thomas Edison's mother was his first teacher? And look how he turned out." "Thomas Edison got kicked out of school," Ethan muttered, then immediately looked terrified that he'd spoken. The next hour devolved into what would later be known among staff as the Great Essay Incident of September. Mrs. Dunham demanded to see my teaching credentials, cited educational theories that hadn't been relevant since the 1950s, and somehow managed to bring up her cousin who almost went to Harvard 3 separate times. The situation was finally diffused when Dr. Martinez arrived, having been alerted by Mrs. Rodriguez that World War III was brewing in room 208. She managed to guide Mrs. Dunham to her office, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and vague threats about contacting the superintendent. After everyone left, I found Ethan still sitting there, looking mortified. "Would you like to tell me about learning to skateboard?" I asked quietly. His face lit up, just for a moment, before the familiar worry lines returned. "Mom says skateboarding is for delinquents who don't care about their futures." "Well," I said, pulling out a chair, "I'd still like to hear about it." That afternoon, Ethan wrote a new essay. It wasn't perfect. There were spelling mistakes and run-on sentences, but it was real. He wrote about falling off his board countless times, about the thrill of finally landing his first ollie, about the friends he made at the skate park. It was genuine, messy, and exactly what a 13-year-old should write. Of course, Mrs. Dunham demanded a revision opportunity when she saw the B+ grade, spawning what would become known as the Grammar Crusades of late September. But that's another story entirely. As autumn leaves began to fall, Mrs. Dunham's intensity rose proportionally with each dropped degree in temperature. The grammar crusades had barely ended when she launched her next campaign, Operation Reading Level. It started innocently enough during our class reading of The Giver. Most students were engaged with the dystopian themes, particularly relating to the idea of a controlled society. Even Ethan seemed to be genuinely enjoying the discussions, cautiously raising his hand to contribute when his mother wasn't lurking outside the classroom windows, a habit she'd developed that had forced us to keep the blinds permanently closed. Then came the reading level tests. Our school used standard assessment software to track students' reading progress. Ethan scored in the 85th percentile, which is excellent by any reasonable measure. But reasonable had left the building long ago. Probably around the same time Mrs. Dunham had started bringing her own electromagnetic field meter to check the classroom's learning optimal radiation levels. I was in the middle of explaining metaphors to my fourth period class when my classroom phone rang. Our secretary's voice was tense. "Miss Campbell, Mrs. Dunham is here with a private reading assessment team." Sure enough, 3 people in professional attire were setting up equipment in our school library. Mrs. Dunham stood among them like a general surveying her troops. "These are certified educational diagnosticians from the Princeton Learning Assessment Center," she announced as I entered. "They'll be conducting a comprehensive evaluation of Ethan's reading capabilities, including cognitive processing speed, comprehension depth, and literary analysis proficiency." I glanced at the team. One looked barely out of college and was struggling to untangle some wires. "Mrs. Dunham, we can't just pull Ethan out of class for unauthorized testing." "Unauthorized?" She pulled out a thick binder. "I have here signed affidavits from 3 educational psychologists, a statement from our family doctor about the importance of accurate academic assessment, and a letter from my attorney regarding the legal precedent for parental educational advocacy." Dr. Martinez arrived, summoned by what I assume was some sort of administrative spider sense for impending chaos. "Helen," she said, being the only person brave enough to use Mrs. Dunham's first name, "this is not how we handle student assessment." What followed was a 2-hour standoff in the library, during which Mrs. Dunham presented a PowerPoint about the inadequacies of standardized testing, called 3 school board members, tried to cite maritime law somehow, threatened to call the local news, actually called the local news, they didn't come, ordered lunch delivery for her assessment team, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in the library corner, reading The Giver, and occasionally glancing up with a mix of embarrassment and resignation that had become his default expression. The situation finally resolved when one of the certified diagnosticians admitted they were actually from a local tutoring center and had been paid double their usual rate to pose as assessment specialists. Mrs. Dunham left in a flurry of threats and designer perfume, but not before announcing she would be taking this to the next level. None of us knew what that meant, but we were about to find out. The next morning, every teacher found a 47-page document in their mailbox titled Comprehensive Reform Proposal for Literary Education Standards, a case study in educational negligence. The appendix included a chart comparing our reading curriculum to those of private schools in Switzerland. But Mrs. Dunham had made a tactical error. In her zeal to prove our reading program inadequate, she'd inadvertently united the entire English department against her. Even Mrs. Peterson, who hadn't attended a faculty meeting since the Clinton administration, emerged from her classroom to join what we called the Literary Liberation Front. We prepared for the next encounter by documenting everything, creating detailed lesson plans that would satisfy a Supreme Court justice, and keeping a shared Google Doc titled The Dunham Chronicles to track every interaction. Little did we know, this was just the warm-up for what would become known as the Shakespeare situation. November brought with it our annual 8th grade production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. In my 12 years of directing this play, I'd seen every possible disaster, fairy wings catching fire, a Puck with stage fright who spoke entirely in whispers, and one memorable year when Bottom's donkey head got stuck and had to be removed with butter from the cafeteria. But nothing could have prepared me for Mrs. Dunham's theatrical ambitions. During auditions, Ethan quietly requested to be part of the stage crew. He seemed genuinely excited about working the lighting board, and I was happy to see him pursuing something independently. I should have known the piece wouldn't last. The cast list went up on a Monday. By Monday afternoon, Mrs. Dunham had filed a formal discrimination complaint, started a petition on change.org titled Drama Inequality in Middle School, a Systemic Crisis, created a Facebook group called Justice for Thespians, somehow obtained my personal phone number and left 17 voicemails. The next morning, she appeared in my classroom before first period, clutching a leather portfolio labeled Dramatic Arts Excellence, the Dunham Method. "Miss Campbell," she began, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "I've reviewed your casting decisions and I must say, I'm deeply concerned about the obvious bias against naturally gifted performers. Mrs. Dunham, Ethan specifically asked to do tech because he's been systematically discouraged from pursuing his obvious dramatic talents." She pulled out a DVD. "I've brought video evidence of Ethan's natural abilities." The video, as it turned out, was footage of 4-year-old Ethan reciting Mary Had a Little Lamb at a preschool pageant. Mrs. Dunham had added professional editing, background music, and somehow subtitles in 3 languages. Furthermore, she continued, pulling out a stack of papers, "I've taken the liberty of rewriting several scenes to better showcase Ethan's range. I've combined the roles of Puck and Oberon into one super character I'm calling Puckeron. It's very avant-garde. Our drama club president, Jenny Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, chose that moment to walk in. Ms. Campbell, we need to discuss the fairy costume budget." "Ah, perfect timing," Mrs. Dunham spun around. "You must be the student playing Titania. I have some thoughts about your character's motivation." "Actually," Jenny said, "I'm Bottom." Mrs. Dunham blinked. "The donkey? But you're a girl." "We do gender-blind casting," I explained, silently thanking the theater gods for sending Jenny at this moment. In 3 years of drama club, she'd developed an immunity to stage mothers that would impress the CDC. Gender-blind? But that's not historically accurate. Shakespeare's plays were performed by all male casts. "Exactly," Jenny replied, not missing a beat. "So by your logic, you should be thrilled that I, regardless of gender, am playing a male role, just like in Shakespeare's time." I watched Mrs. Dunham's face go through the 5 stages of grief in record time as she tried to find a flaw in this logic. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Dunham showed up at every rehearsal with suggestions, tried to bribe our Puck with acting lessons, sent the drama club Broadway vocal coaching videos, hired a Shakespeare scholar to analyze our interpretation, attempted to reblock the entire forest scene to give the trees, where Ethan would have been, more emotional depth. The situation came to a head during our technical rehearsal. Mrs. Dunham had somehow discovered that our Puck had a dentist appointment and saw her opportunity. She arrived with Ethan in a hastily assembled fairy costume, complete with professional stage makeup. "Since you're down an actor," she announced, "Ethan can step in. He knows all the lines." This was true. She'd made him memorize the entire play just in case. What she hadn't counted on was Ethan himself. Standing there in green tights and glitter, something in him finally snapped. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "I don't want to be Puck. I don't want to be Puckeron. I want to do the lights." The auditorium went silent. Even the drama kids, who treated every moment as an opportunity for performance, stood quietly. "But sweetie," Mrs. Dunham started, "your talent." "My talent is tech," Ethan's voice grew stronger. "I'm good at it. I like it. And for once, I'd like to do something without you taking over." Mrs. Dunham staggered back as if physically struck. I don't." "Yes, you do," Ethan continued. "You take over everything, my homework, my activities, my whole life. Did you ever ask what I want?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ghost light seemed to dim in respect. The Shakespeare incident, as it came to be known, marked a subtle shift in the Dunham dynamic. Mrs. Dunham didn't stop her campaigns of educational terrorism, but something had changed. She started sending only 12 emails a day instead of her usual 20. Her classroom observations dropped from thrice daily to once. She even stopped testing the drinking fountains for mineral content. The play was a success, largely thanks to Ethan's impressive command of the lighting board. He created effects that made our budget production look almost professional, including a complicated forest sequence that had the audience gasping. Mrs. Dunham sat in the front row on opening night, alternating between beaming with pride and scribbling notes about missed theatrical opportunities. But like the eye of a hurricane, this relative calm was merely a prelude to what we would come to call the December disaster. It started with our annual holiday writing festival. Students were asked to write creative pieces, stories, poems, or essays about winter themes. The best works would be published in the school literary magazine and read aloud at our winter assembly. Ethan wrote a poem about snowboarding. It was genuine, passionate, and completely his own work. I could tell because it had the kind of authentic voice you can't fake. Plus, it included words like sick and gnarly that Mrs. Dunham would rather die than use in formal writing. I gave it an A. The next morning, Mrs. Dunham arrived with what appeared to be a small filing cabinet under her arm. "This," she announced, dropping it on my desk with a thud that made my coffee mug jump, "is Ethan's real submission." Inside was a 30-page manifesto on the historical significance of winter solstice celebrations across various cultures, complete with footnotes and a bibliography longer than most master's theses. "Mrs. Dunham," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "the assignment was for the students to write their own pieces." "This is his own piece," she insisted. "I merely provided research materials, structural guidance, thematic suggestions, and stylistic oversight. Oh, and I revised the final draft 17 times. So everything except the actual writing?" Her eyes narrowed. "I sense hostility toward parent involvement. I sense a mother doing her son's homework." What followed was a debate that made our previous confrontations look like friendly chats. Mrs. Dunham pulled out a spiral-bound presentation on the importance of academic rigor, letters of recommendation from Ethan's third-grade teachers, a psychological analysis of the benefits of parental academic support, someone's doctoral thesis on helicopter parenting, though I suspect she misinterpreted its conclusions. The situation escalated when she discovered Ethan's original poem had been selected for the assembly reading. "This is an outrage," she declared. That skateboarding thing doesn't showcase his true intellectual capabilities." "Actually," came a quiet voice from the doorway, "it's about snowboarding." Ethan stood there, holding his lunch tray. For the first time, he looked more annoyed than embarrassed. "And I want to read it at the assembly," he continued. "It's mine. I wrote it. About something I actually care about." Mrs. Dunham's face went through several interesting color changes. "But, sweetheart, the solstice paper is basically a Wikipedia article you rewrote," Ethan interrupted. "Mom, I'm 13. I'm supposed to write about things 13-year-olds like, not whatever a comparative analysis of Germanic Yuletide traditions is." The lunch tray trembled slightly in his hands, but his voice remained steady. Mrs. Dunham pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Dr. Stevenson." "Your therapist?" Ethan asked. "No, my educational consultant." "Maybe," I suggested gently, "you should call the first one." What happened next would go down in Riverside Middle School history. Mrs. Dunham launched into a speech that started with Ivy League admission statistics, somehow detoured through a comparison of Finnish and American educational systems, and ended with her threatening to start her own school where excellence isn't persecuted. Meanwhile, Ethan calmly sat down, ate his lunch, and then asked if he could practice his poem for the assembly. The winter assembly was scheduled for the last day before holiday break. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents, all ready to celebrate the season and sprint toward vacation. The air smelled like peppermint and teenage anxiety. Mrs. Dunham arrived early, armed with a professional video camera and what appeared to be a small legal team. She'd spent the previous week trying to reorganize the program order to maximize audience engagement metrics, install additional lighting for optimal presentation conditions, submit her own introduction for Ethan's reading, 4 pages, single-spaced, convince the music department to provide orchestral accompaniment. I spotted Ethan backstage, pacing with his poem. For once, his shoelaces were tied, though one was already working itself loose, as if returning to its natural state. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, "Just nervous. Mom's got the whole thing streaming live to my relatives. Even my cousin in Sweden is watching. Just remember, it's your poem, your voice." "Miss Campbell?" He looked up, anxiety creasing his forehead. What if she's right? What if I'm wasting my potential writing about snowboarding instead of, comparative literature or whatever? Before I could answer, we heard a commotion in the audience. Mrs. Dunham was rearranging seats to create what she called an optimal viewing trajectory. 3 parents had already been displaced, and the camera crew, when did she hire a camera crew, was setting up additional lighting. Principal Martinez intervened before it could escalate into what would surely have been dubbed the Great Seating Chart Rebellion of 2023. The assembly began. We sat through the usual holiday fare, the band's slightly off-key jingle bells, the student council's presentation about their canned food drive, and a surprisingly political speech about candy cane consumption from our 7th grade environmentalist. Then it was time for the creative readings. Jenny from Drama Club read her story about a department store mannequin that came to life. Mrs. Dunham was heard whispering, "Derivative," loud enough for 3 rows to hear. The 6th grade winner shared a lovely poem about her grandmother's latkes. And then it was Ethan's turn. He walked to the microphone, his paper shaking slightly. From the audience came the whir of Mrs. Dunham's camera equipment and what sounded like a small generator. "My poem is called First Powder," he began. What followed was 2 minutes of pure, authentic 13-year-old joy. Ethan's poem captured everything about learning to snowboard: the cold fear of the first run, the thrill of finally staying upright, the perfect silence of early morning on the slopes. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was real. The audience loved it. Even the too cool for everything 8th graders were nodding along. Everyone burst into applause when he finished. Everyone except Mrs. Dunham. She stood up in the middle of the applause, striding toward the stage. "We'll take it again from the top," she announced. "Ethan, remember to maintain proper posture and project from your diaphragm. And let's try it with the alternative version I prepared." "Mom, no!" Ethan's voice came through the microphone, clear and firm. "Sweetie, I'm just trying to help." "You're not helping." The words exploded from him with such force that the microphone squealed. "You're trying to turn me into some kind of performance robot. I don't want to be perfect. I want to be me." The auditorium went silent. You could hear the heating system hum. "But I just want what's best for you," Mrs. Dunham said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Do you?" Ethan asked. "Or do you want what's best for your idea of me?" Mrs. Dunham stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her camera crew looked at each other awkwardly, unsure if they should keep filming. "I'm proud of my poem," Ethan continued. "I'm proud of my B+ in history. I'm proud that I can land a 360 on my snowboard. And I wish I wish you could be proud of who I actually am, not who you're trying to make me be." The silence that followed was heavier than all the textbooks in Mrs. Dunham's supplementary reading collection combined. What happened next was something I never expected to see. Mrs. Dunham cried. Not the tactical tears she'd employed during the great calculator controversy of October, but real, mascara-running tears. She sat down right there in the middle of the aisle, her perfect posture crumbling. The camera crew, showing more wisdom than their previous actions suggested, packed up and quietly left. Principal Martinez smoothly announced a brief intermission, and the auditorium slowly emptied, leaving just Ethan, Mrs. Dunham, myself, and a very confused janitor who'd come to fix a squeaky door. Mrs. Dunham's voice was barely audible. "I just didn't want you to struggle like I did." Ethan climbed down from the stage and sat next to his mother. "What do you mean?" "I was average in school," she confessed, as if admitting to a terrible crime. "Just average. My parents never pushed me, never helped me reach my full potential. I had to fight for everything. I didn't want that for you." "Mom," Ethan said gently, "being average isn't the worst thing in the world." "But you're not average," she insisted. "You're special." "Maybe," he agreed, "but not because of my grades or test scores. Maybe I'm special because I can do a kickflip on my skateboard, or because I know how to program the lighting board, or because I write poems about snowboarding." I watched something shift in Mrs. Dunham's expression, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of her perfectly made-up face. "When?" She hesitated. "When did you get so wise?" "Probably around the time you hired that wisdom coach last summer," Ethan said with a small smile. "Though I don't think this is what he meant by reaching enlightenment." Mrs. Dunham actually laughed, a real laugh, not her usual careful chuckle. The aftermath of what became known as the holiday revelation was gradual but significant. Mrs. Dunham didn't change overnight. Leopards don't easily change their spots, especially when those spots have been reinforced with advanced placement courses and private tutoring. But there were changes. Her emails decreased to a manageable 3 per week. She joined a parent support group, though she did try to reorganize it initially. She allowed Ethan to join the skateboarding club after only minimal research into helmet safety standards. She even, miraculously, accepted a B- on his science project without filing a single appeal. The biggest change was in Ethan. He started speaking up more in class, letting his natural humor shine through. His shoelaces remained persistently untied, but his smile appeared more frequently. He joined the school's tech crew officially and helped modernize our entire performance space. By spring, Mrs. Dunham had channeled her organizational energy into actually helpful ventures. She coordinated a highly successful fundraiser for new lab equipment, though we had to talk her down from trying to acquire a particle accelerator. She even started a parent-teacher book club, which only occasionally devolved into debates about educational philosophy. On the last day of school, she brought me a coffee. Not a complex custom order, just a simple cup of coffee. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for not giving up on either of us." "That's what teachers do," I replied. "We see the potential in everyone, even the parents." Ethan graduated from 8th grade with a solid B+ average, 3 skateboarding trophies, and a reputation as the best lighting tech in school history. His final project was a video presentation about finding balance, both on a snowboard and in life. Mrs. Dunham filmed it, but let him edit it himself. She still comes by the school sometimes, usually to help with drama productions or fundraisers. The other teachers no longer dive for cover when they see her coming. Some even seek her out for her organizational skills, though we've learned to be specific about boundaries. Last week I saw them in the parking lot after school. Ethan was showing his mom how to stand on a skateboard while she clutched his arm, both of them laughing. Her power suit was slightly wrinkled, and her hair was less than perfect. but she looked happier than I'd ever seen her. Sometimes the biggest lessons in middle school aren't learned by the students at all.
If you enjoyed watching this helicopter mom's wings get clipped by reality, hit subscribe for more stories of entitlement meeting consequences. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Entitled File.